Good morning. Good morning.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to get us started. Um, I just wanted to say how excited I am to be facilitating this conversation today. In as someone who studies the Latino South, I have really appreciated what these scholars are bringing to and leading this conversation. As is the case in much of Latino studies, whiteness and in many cases non-Blackness has remained the central organizing principle, marginalizing Black Latinos both in our historical accounts, intellectual spaces, and communities. So I'm hoping that this roundtable today is working against that trend and centering the story of Black Latinos and the story of the US South. Building on the excellent work of all of our scholars here today, as well as Frank Garitti's work on Afro-Cubans in the South, Jennifer Jones and Ben Vinson's work on Afro-Mexicans in North Carolina, and Vanessa Valdez's work on Schomburg during his time at Fisk University. Our panel today will talk about the history of Black Latinos in the U.S. South and how their stories challenge emergent narratives about the history of Latinos in the South. This group of scholars here today is doing work that I believe explodes many of these fields of inquiry and allows us to think differently about race, Latinidad, and the US South. I'm really honored to get to facilitate and ask questions and learn along with the rest of the audience. So I will introduce each of our panelists individually and then just open the floor up to some of the questions we've agreed on as a panel and then turn to the audience. Although audience members are welcome to introduce questions at any time, I'll keep an eye on the Q&A so that our panelists don't have to. So I'd like to start by introducing Dr. Devyn Benson. Dr. Devyn Spence-Benson is an associate professor of history and African American and Africana studies at the University of Kentucky. She is a 20th century historian who focuses on anti-racist movements across the Americas and the Caribbean. Her teaching and research interests sit at the intersection of Africana and Latin American studies, and she has worked throughout her career to merge these two interdisciplinary fields by focusing on Afro-Cuban history, politics, and culture. Benson has taught at Williams College, Louisiana State University, Davidson College, and now the University of Kentucky. She's the author of published articles and reviews in the Hispanic American Historical Review, Journal of Transnational American Studies, Cuban Studies, World Policy Journal, and Pallara, publication of the Afro-Latin American Research Association. Benson's work has been supported by the Doris G. Quinn Foreign Language and Area Studies, or FLAS, and Gaius Charles Bolin Dissertation Fellowships. She has also held residencies at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem and the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute for African and African American Research at the Hudgens Center at Harvard University. Her first book, Anti-Racism in Cuba, The Unfinished Revolution, is based on over 18 months of field research in Cuba, where she has traveled annually since 2003. She is also the editor for the English translation of Afro-Cubanas, History, Thought, and Cultural Practices. Her newest project, Black Consciousness in Cuba, The Untold Revolution, explores the trans-Caribbean collaborations between English, French, and Spanish-speaking Black Caribbean intellectuals to show how Caribbean Black consciousness flourished in Cuba in the 1960s and 1970s. This book project has been supported by a National Endowment for the Humanities year-long fellowship and is currently under contract with UNC Press. She is also working with our co-panelist, Danielle Cleland from the University of Texas at Austin, to collect oral histories, publish a book, and create a digital humanities website about Black Cubans in the United States. This project was recently awarded a Russell Sage Foundation research grant. So thank you, Dr. Benson, for being with us. Now, I'd like to introduce Shantee Rosado. Shantee Rosado is an assistant professor of Afro-Latinx Studies in the Africana and Latino and Caribbean Studies Department at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. She received her PhD in sociology with a certificate in Latin American and Latinx Studies from the University of Pennsylvania in 2019. Her work examines racial inequalities and identities among Latinos in the US and Latin America, as well as Afro-Latinos and popular culture, Professor Rosado's current book project, entitled Latinx and Latinos and the Emotional Politics of Race and Blackness in the U.S., examines how collective emotions shape the racial and political ideologies of second-generation Puerto Ricans and Dominicans in Central Florida. In addition to her solo-authored book project, she is currently co-authoring a manuscript entitled The Sociology of Cardi B, a Black Trap Feminist Approach. Professor Rosado is a proud member of the Black Latinas No Collective. Dr. Paul Joseph López Oro is an assistant professor of Africana Studies at Smith College and the 2021 and 2022 Miriam Jimenez Roman Fellow at the Latinx Project at New York University. His research and teaching interests are on Black Latin American and U.S. Afro-Latinx social movements, hemispheric Black political mobilizations, and Black feminisms and LGBTQ plus activism, theories, and ethnographies. His in-progress manuscript, tentatively titled Indigenous Blackness in the Americas, The Queer Politics of Self-Making Garifuna in New York, is a transdisciplinary ethnographic study on how gender and sexuality shapes the way in which transgenerational Garifuna New Yorkers of Central American descent negotiate, perform, and articulate their multiple subjectivities as Black, Indigenous, and Central American Caribbeans. And finally, Danielle Cleland. Dr. Danielle Pilar Cleland is an associate professor in the Department of Mexican American and Latino Studies at the University of Texas in Austin. She's a political scientist who examines comparative Black politics, group consciousness, Black public opinion, and racial inequality with a focus on the Spanish-speaking Caribbean and the United States. Dr. Cleland's book, The Power of Race in Cuba, Racial Ideology and Black Consciousness During the Revolution, won the Best Book Award from the Race, Ethnicity, and Politics section of the American Political Science Association and the W.E.B. Du Bois Distinguished Book Award from the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. Dr. Clealand is currently working on 2 new projects focusing on Blackness within Latino communities, an oral and political history of Black Cubans in the United States with our co-panelist, Devyn Spence-Benson, and a second that examines political attitudes, experiences with racism, and identity among Afro-Latinos in the United States. Dr. Cleland's work can be found in Annual Review of Political Science, Ethnic and Racial Studies, Politics, Groups, and Identities, the Journal of Latin American Studies, and Souls. She serves on the editorial board for the Journal of Latin American and Caribbean Ethnic Studies and the National Review of Black Politics. Whew. We did it. You are very esteemed, and it meant that I was talking for longer than expected. So let's start by you all. Now that I've introduced you, I'd love to start by having you all introduce yourselves a little bit in your work and how your current work intersects with this topic of Afro-Latinos in the U.S. South. And we can go in the order maybe that I introduced you all. So we could start with Dr. Benson and then go to Dr. Rosado.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And next time I'll make sure that I pare that down. There was no need for me to have sent in the introduction that long, but thank you for organizing us. And it's so exciting to be here with everyone today. So I will just start off actually going relatively briefly because since I'm working with Dr. Clealand, we can sort of share the stage on this one. But the project that we're working on now is an oral and political history of Black Cubans in the United States. The goal is to collect 100 oral histories of Black Cubans in the US, focusing mainly on South Florida, but we also have about 20% of the oral histories are from the New York area, and other places in the United States, but mostly New York, New Jersey. We came to this project for different reasons in some ways that sort of just brought us together, which is the reason it's a collaboration. So maybe I'll start off saying how I came to the project, and I'll let Danielle share how she came to the project. Most of my work has been on Cuba, right? So I work on race and racism in the Cuban Revolution, focused specifically on the 1960s. My first book was about the 1960s. So I'm writing this book about how the Castro government interacts with Blacks and racial politics and what that looked like on the island. And there was a chapter, because there had to be, about the ways that race looked in exile. Because what the revolutionary government did was they said, well, of course, everybody who left is racist. And so all the people who stay support racial integration. And so I was looking at that inside of Cuba. But I was like, well, I wonder did everyone who leave was racist? Is that what it looked like? And what were narratives about race and racism looking like in exile? And did Black Cubans leave? Because the revolutionary government said they did in many ways. So that led me to write this chapter about racial politics in exile, looking at Cubans in South Florida. And I was doing research at the Cuban Heritage Collection. So I'm at the Cuban Heritage Collection and I'm asking, I was like, well, can you show me all the stuff that you have on Black Cubans? And they're sort of looking at me like, well, we don't really have that much. And I was like, excuse me? I was like, I have done some oral histories. I've talked to folks. I know that they're Black Cubans who came in the 1960s. And their response is, well, it's about relationships. And if you know, if folks don't give their stuff to the archive, then we don't have it. And I was like, but you're the Cuban Heritage Collection. Like, you're supposed to represent all Cubans in the United States. And so it was really frustrating. And so that led me to start thinking, like, we really need to collect more oral histories of Black Cubans. The Cuban Heritage Collection has its own oral history project that has hundreds of oral histories with Cubans in the United States. And probably the last time I counted, 5 to 8 of them were with people who would be considered Black and mulatto. So again, there was this sort of vacuum, it felt in my mind as a historian, of someone to collect the histories of Black Cubans who came to the United States, because we know they came. And when we talk to them, they talk about the community that they built. So that's sort of what brought me to this project. And we can talk more about the things that we've discovered, but it's been fascinating to talk to so many Black Cubans who say, look, we don't want to be invisible. And we're like, that's the whole point of the project, because in most of the sort of traditional spaces, Black Cubans continue to be invisible in the United States.
I believe I'm next, right? Okay. And I can't mute myself because my computer is like freaking out, so I'm trying to like not touch it. But, so yeah, I do work, my current project is on Puerto Ricans and Dominicans in Central Florida. I think Central Florida is a really exciting and interesting place to be looking at Afro-Latinidades right now. There's been, as many of you know, a huge demographic shift in that region in the past 20 years, and particularly in the Orlando, Kissimmee area, the central Florida, the center of Central Florida, because Tampa already had like a significant Cuban population prior to this, but Puerto Ricans have been increasing in that area exponentially in the past 20 years, which is what kind of drew my attention to that region, and particularly trying to understand the significance of these groups. Hey, shout out to Central Florida. Drop which county you're from or which city. And I think because Florida is always seen politically as like this huge player, right? It's the swing state. You think about the Bush-Gore election, you think about the Trump election, the Trump-Hillary election. It's a huge player, right? It matters a lot in presidential elections, and the politics there are always kind of seen as like just very like wild, right? Like you can't predict what people are gonna do, and it gets framed as like the Cubans are Republicans, and and then there's other folks, but it's not really as paid attention to. And so I was really looking closely at the election. Hey, Winter Park. I was looking at the 2016 election as my research was approaching, as kind of like, oh, it would be really interesting to see what Puerto Ricans and Dominicans and other groups, but particularly those, are thinking about these candidates, which is what brought me down there. I was also really interested in how race operates in the region, given I knew that particular area was very white and very like, not just white, but like Southern white, racist, KKK areas in that region prior to the influx of Puerto Ricans to that area. So I was like, oh, let me I would be interested in these stories. And interviewing folks there, the majority of folks that I interviewed were Northern transplants. So they had, come from the islands to the Northeast, and then from the Northeast to Florida. So they have very particular experiences of kind of that differentiation between the North and the South and what that meant for them. They talked about, isolation and about how the area was incredibly white for the most part of their childhoods, and then how that, increasingly changed. But as with any area that changes drastically over a short period of time, people have ambivalent feelings about those changes. So now my work is looking at what those changes mean for folks in that region, particularly after Hurricane Maria and the influx of more Puerto Ricans to Central Florida, both from the Northeast and from the island, and how those interactions kind of play out in terms of racialization, but also in terms of the emotions that people attach to race in that region, how people read each other in that region, which I think is very different than in other parts of Florida even. So I'll leave it there, but yeah, so grateful to be here.
Good morning. Good morning.
Morning.
Hope audio, all of it, it's good and clear. Can folks hear me? Yes. Okay. So first and foremost, thank you to Professor Márquez for the invitation to be part of this conversation. I'm grateful to be part of this conversation because of the many years we've been in dialogue, especially about New Yorkers. The South emerges really interestingly in my work in a way that as like a third generation Brooklynite did not kind of really anticipate, particularly because the South becomes the belly of entrance, right? It's literally port of entry for Black Central Americans, right? Particularly folks who generationally participated in the United Fruit Company, right? Thinking about New Orleans as kind of not just this, Black Atlantic world, but like literally how does the South become this port of entry, and then how New York City becomes an extension of the South. So part of the work that I'm thinking through, particularly for this book, but I also think for like a book project to think about Black Central Americans in the US South would be something that I'm potentially interested in. But the South becomes the big space where it's memorialized and remembered collectively by Garifuna New Yorkers as is like, yeah, I had a grandfather or I had a tío or I had a dad, right, go through the South, right? And the South becomes the first place. And how in many ways the South is noticing now in ethnographic work in Garifuna, New York, is that the South becomes this romantic space of like, the American dream is possible because the American dream in New York City is this nightmare. So there's this interesting dichotomy that emerges with the urban, kind of this understanding of New York City as this urban metropolis, right? But also thinking about the South as this kind of, right, even this idea of like the South reminds me of Honduras, right? This idea that the South reminds me of the Caribbean coast. So I'm thinking about how the South is really imagined discursively. And particularly I'm interested in that migration of Garifuna New Yorkers to Houston, right? So to Houston, Texas, right? Or to the return like Louisiana, right? And not just New Orleans, but different parts of Louisiana, right? And I think in particular, what I've always been struck by, and I always try to bring this into my classroom, is to think about how is the South always in conversation to the hemisphere, right? How can we think about the U.S. South if we were to kind of pause and think beyond the geopolitical borders of the United States, right? Or what we understand to be the imperial borders of the United States? What we kind of really walk away with about the U.S. South is that we walk away with an understanding of hemispheric Blackness and how hemispheric Blackness has been already always in conversation with Blackness from Canada to Argentina, right? And I think the South becomes this incredibly important moment, particularly in the context of Black Central Americans and Black Central Americans of Caribbean descent, to have an entry point into the U.S. And what I've noticed a lot in the work with Garifuna New Yorkers in particular, it's this generational kind of divide, right, with Garifuna New Yorkers of folks wanting to come back to the South because the South is a lot more, there's always this interesting moment that comes up when I interview folks from the South Bronx and Eastern Brooklyn, and they're like, I just feel at home in the South, right? There's something about the South that becomes a place of safety, right? That there's this idea that New York is always kind of an American nightmare, right? And that has a lot to do with the geographies of where Garifuna New Yorkers are located in New York, right? And I think when we think about Black immigrants, there's this persistent narrative of like middle class, social mobility, but there are Black immigrants who don't have access to social mobility, who don't have access to middle class status, right? And the South becomes this place of potential middle class status, right? So I remember conducting an oral history project with Aurelio Martinez, right, who's really well known as a musician in the Garifuna community, but who has also found a home in Atlanta, Georgia, right? And even though a lot of his base is in Brooklyn, he finds a home in Atlanta, Georgia, because he also finds other Black diasporic communities in Atlanta, Georgia, that feel much more affirming and feel much more supportive. So I'm always thinking about how the South is in conversation to other parts of the Black diaspora in the US, but also how in very much ways, it's a perfect example of how Blackness has always been hemispheric and local simultaneously. So, yeah.
Hi, everybody. So I will, I guess, continue with where Devyn left off, but I came to this project really as somebody who was living in Miami. I lived there for 8 years. I was at FIU, and I was just fascinated with Miami, this crazy bubble, right? Where one, as a Black Latina, I experienced the most racism I had ever experienced in my life, and I had lived in North Carolina and Boston and other places, right, that you might associate with racist experiences, and two, just the kind of way, and the reason I wanted to talk about whiteness today in this conversation about Afro-Latinidad is that whiteness operates in a very explicit way in Miami among Latinos. And so I think that, when we're talking about Latinos nationally, we are often talking about this kind of mestizo-ness, right? Or this mixedness, or this not quite whiteness, even though whiteness is operating right within our communities. But in Miami, there is this sense of I am white, right? I am proud of being white, and I don't have a lot of problem with my anti-Blackness. And it's something that operates in people's everyday lives. And so that was part of it for me, just the experience of being there. And then I started working on this Miami Wealth Report with Derek Hamilton, Sandy Darity, Alan Aha, other folks that work on wealth and race. And we started looking at the history of Cuban Americans coming into Miami. And I would find these kind of, thrown in references of, Black Cubans that came to Miami had to go to Black segregated schools, or Black Cubans that came to Miami, had to experience Jim Crow. And it was usually one sentence in a book. And so I'm saying, but wait a minute now. If Black Cubans are coming here in 59, 60, 61, 62, and they're being told to sit at the back of the bus, they're being told that they can't go to the same schools as their Cuban counterparts that are coming with them who are lighter. If they're being told that they can't live in the same neighborhoods that most of the Cubans are moving into, these are totally different trajectories that nobody has explored. Where did they live? Where did they go to school? What did they do? Who was their community? And so, Devyn and I started talking about this, and, the only real way to kind of capture what happened during that time is through oral histories, to interview families and to ask them what their experiences were, what their parents' experiences were. And so that we can kind of take, what we know about residential segregation and school segregation during Jim Crow, and we can add these experiences to them so we can understand exactly how this happened. What were the practices that people, undertook? What were the patterns that were existing at the time, right? And so we find that it's really white Cubans that are excluding Black Cubans once they become established in Miami. And so we really kind of want to push up against this narrative of whiteness among Cubans, but also this idea that, Cubans have this kind of successful story of, the sun is coming in on me, the successful story of economic success, political success, and really say yes, right? But access to all of that, meant that you needed to be white, right? Whiteness was the access to all of this success, and that Black Cubans were living alternative lives and building, their kind of community parallel to that. And so, it's really part of, my current research agenda of just trying to tell these Black stories in our communities so that we understand intra-Latino racism that exists, so that we understand, how Blackness, within our communities really operates, how it makes us think about our positions, our politics, our identities, and to really understand, who we are. Because I think, we all know in this panel that there's been so little work on, who we are and what that means, for politics, for social movements, for our communities in general, community building, and where we fit into this picture of, all of the kind of marginalization that we find among Black folks in general, and how we kind of build despite that. So that's basically what I'm doing with both projects, and we have our first Afro-Latino sample in the collaborative multiracial election survey. And so we're really excited about, you know, we have a sample of 1,000, over 1,000. And so that'll be, you know, data that we can really use to, you know, map folks's, you know, political attitudes, identity, you know, thoughts about identity, income, demographics, where people live, right? Subgroups, you know, all of the things, skin color, all of the things that we want to know, and that we're just kind of observing. So yeah, so that's what I'm doing.
Great. So you sort of got us started thinking about, I should also say, if folks in the audience want to put any questions in, I'll ask another question and then I'll sort of go back in between. You got us started thinking about this question with this discussion about whiteness and segregation, and the sort of segregated racial nature of Latinidad when we look from the vantage point of Cuba. I mean, I'm sorry, of Miami. But I'm curious how you all are thinking about region in your work and what it does when we put Afro-Latinos in the center of the South, right? The center of the story of the South, you know, or the many Souths, right? Because I mean, we have multiple people on, even just on this panel, talking about Florida. And Florida's a big and weird place with lots of different things happening. So I'm just curious, when we put Afro-Latinos in the center of the story of the South, what changes for you all?
Well, I kind of like to say that not a lot changes, right? I mean, part of the part of the story that we're telling is that, you know, not that Black, you know, immigrants had a different story, but to kind of tell what their stories are alongside African Americans or Black Americans. And so for us, it's saying, you know, that Jim Crow is happening, and there are all of these different communities, right, that are experiencing Jim Crow. You know, anti-Blackness. You know, Miami is an anti-Black city, but there are a lot of different groups within Miami that are experiencing that anti-Blackness. It's not just Black Americans. And so I think, you know, we're expanding the story about Blackness, but we're also finding that, you know, these experiences are really very similar when we look at Black Americans and Black Latinos or Black immigrant groups in general.
Yes. And just to build on that, this question makes me think about the work of Jemima Pierre. So she writes this powerful essay on how social scientists who do work on Black immigrants really use this kind of narrative, right? This kind of, you know, this Mary Waters moment where it's like, you know, Black immigrants are using their ethnicity to distance themselves from African Americans because, God forbid, that Black immigrants assimilate themselves into African American politics and culture and life, right? And it's really rooted in this idea that, you know, social scientists inherently believe that there's some pathology within African American culture, right? So this big argument, it's like, well, Black immigrants are finding social mobility in other spaces and not in Black American spaces. What I think we really uncover in the many Souths, right? And I do want to think about New York City as part of the South, right? Even though geographically it's not rooted in the South, there are parts of New York that are very much the South. And because the people are there are Southern folks, right? And I think people and the way people make place, and particularly Black folks, how we make place and how we make space for our culture, our politics, our multiple identities, right, is really important. So to think about centering, you know, Black Latinx folks, Spanish speaking Black folks, right, into a narrative, what we actually really uncover is, you know, to build on Professor Clealand's, like, an expansiveness of Blackness that transcends the nation state, that transcends national borders, right? And that in fact, the way the structures of white supremacy and anti-Blackness work, those ethnic divides and differences mean really nothing, right, to the continued terror of anti-Blackness, right? That in fact, it does not matter that a Garifuna Central American speaks Spanish, they will continue to experience the same level of anti-Blackness, right? And in fact, some folks even argue, you know, I'm thinking about the work of Miriam Jimenez Roman and Juan Flores, right? Like in certain, you know, there's moments of like even triple consciousness, which for a really long time I've had like I don't know, I'm not really sure about this triple consciousness thing, because I would also argue that Latinidad is a failed project for Black Latinos, right? So like Latinos don't become legible in Latinidad. So it's actually not a triple consciousness, but that's just me. I'm still working through it. I think there's an expansiveness and the ability to look at the more nuanced complexities of anti-Blackness when we think about Black Latinx folks.
Well, I would like to say a little bit on that. Unless you want to go first, Dr. Benson. Oh, okay. Just thinking about that triple consciousness, because I was just before this reading one of the excerpts from the interviews that I did, and it was, you know, 30-something-year-old Dominican woman who was living in St. Cloud. Anyone from Central Florida probably has some ideas about St. Cloud. It's known as like a particularly racist space, very white holdout, right? Despite all the changes in the region, this area has kind of remained like that area that everyone's like, I don't go to St. Cloud. Like, and so this Dominican woman, this Black Dominican woman living in St. Cloud, was talking about how she's had this experience where, you know, she used to work at a supermarket and white Americans would walk in and try and connect with her over xenophobia and be like, oh, all these, you know, Puerto Ricans moving in, all these Latinos moving in, and he's Hispanics, blah, 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 right? And so she's experiencing that kind of like weird in-between space, right? Of like trying to understand her place within that. And then she also had experiences where she would be speaking Spanish with one of her coworkers, and a white American would walk in and be like, hey, you need to stop, like, speak English. This is America, you know, the typical like dialogue there. So I think centering kind of that experience of Afro-Latinos in Central Florida really kind of shows that like that race matters, Blackness matters, that we don't exist apart from white, like from American whiteness and Blackness, but rather that we exist within and as part of it, that we can perpetuate it, right? Because I also had, you know, respondents who were very much like, I get mad at Black people because I've been treated negatively as a dark-skinned Puerto Rican or Dominican. I'm mad at African Americans because of how I'm treated, right? So it really does matter not only how people self-identify and not even how they're racialized, but also how they feel about those experiences, and then where they place their anger, where they place their, you know, feelings of being upset about their oppression. And so that's kind of where my work tries to fit in and complicate these simplified narratives of like, Black people are going to stick together, and, you know, it's like, that's not always the case, right? Like, it's not always the case. And I saw it's very complex in Central Florida in that sense, that not only, like, not just because someone experiences anti-Blackness are they then willing to sign on to the project of combating racism or even challenging racism, because it also requires people to see themselves as connected, right? As connected as part of a community with African Americans. And in Central Florida, it is incredibly segregated. And I would say that a lot of Puerto Ricans and Dominicans drink the Kool-Aid, right? Drink the nationalist Kool-Aid of like, we're Puerto Rican or Dominican first, and then whatever else, right? So I think it is very complicated, very different from the case with Cubans, for sure. So when people ask me, like, can you talk about Cubans in your research? I'm like, absolutely not, because it's not the same thing. And even with Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, I'm talking about so many differences. There's so many differences. So I think in that kind of centering of Afro-Latinos in the South, we also have to think about those particular histories, right? Not just the history of race, but also the histories, as Dr. Oro was talking about, the histories of colonization and of migration and how people end up here. All those things matter for understanding how Afro-Latinos matter in the South.
I don't think I have much to add. I mean, I think one of the things that comes across, especially as Dr. Clealand and Dr. Oro were talking about, is that focusing on Afro-Latinos in the South lets us see how white supremacy works and how anti-Blackness works. And probably the two best examples that I see where we get to see not only how white supremacy is working, but then the strategies that Black Cubans in our case or Afro-Latinos are using to combat that white supremacy become really interesting. So for example, one of the ones that we see over and over in our oral histories is the issue with housing. Right? We know because of Jim Crow segregation that oftentimes Black peoples couldn't live in certain neighborhoods. Well, what we saw with Black Cubans, both starting in 1959 and coming almost all the way to the present, is that when they were looking for spaces to rent in white Cuban neighborhoods, often these were white Cuban neighborhoods, right? So this is a different way, like Dr. Clealand was saying about how white supremacy is working in Miami. They're trying to rent in these white Cuban neighborhoods. They would call, they would speak Spanish, and on the phone, the apartment is available. You show up with your Black self to the door, the apartment is no longer available. Right. So what are the strategies that Black Cubans then learned and mobilized is sometimes they would send a lighter skinned relative to show up at the door to still rent. Right. We had one interviewee who talked about how he literally said, I'm going to use a civil rights case against you. Right. Someone who knew that civil rights movement was happening. It was like, I'm going to sue you for this because they knew about that from African-American friends and African-American readings. So that became one strategy. And then probably the other was just that Black Cubans created their own spaces. So just the same ways that African Americans start creating neighborhoods to live in and having a whole culture and politics inside of those neighborhoods, we found the same for Black Cubans. And that's something that hasn't come up in the literature before because these were strategies that Black Cubans used to survive and thrive outside of the ways that white supremacy was working in their lives. And then I can speak later more about policing, but I think that's another interesting one, right? When we think about white supremacy and anti-Blackness and the way that it works in the South, we often think of policing, but what does it look like when we say, well, oftentimes in Miami's case, that the white Cubans are the police officers and the Black Cubans are the ones that they're profiling, and yet they're sitting there speaking Spanish as if the white police officers are speaking Spanish as if they think that the Black person that they pulled over can't understand them. And so then our respondents would say, but wait, I knew exactly what they were saying, and when I responded in Spanish, sometimes they let them off, sometimes they didn't because of the way white supremacy works. And I think focusing on Afro-Latinx communities in the South lets us sort of have another lens to think about white supremacy and policing and housing segregation.
And I think I just want to jump in for a minute because Shantee, I was thinking about what you said about this kind of, living as a Black person, but also harboring these anti-Black sentiments. And it's not that different for Cubans, right? So when we think about Virginia Key, right, which is the beach where, the Black segregated beach in Miami during Jim Crow, where Black folks would go, Black Americans are there, Jamaicans are there, Bahamians are there, and Black Cubans are there also, right? They're all at this beach. But Black Cuban mothers are also telling their children to stay away from Black Americans. And so they're still, while at the same time, they still kind of support civil rights. And, we have all of these stories about them standing in line, for 7 hours to vote for Barack Obama, even when they voted for Reagan, right? Some years before that. So there's all these complexities about, being Black and being, in, Cuban or Puerto Rican or Dominican or Honduran or, whatever it is. And, how you feel about Blackness as a movement, how you feel about Black Americans, how you feel about your own Blackness. And so, I think we have to talk about the anti-Blackness, among, Black Latinos, but also, talk about how that's really complex and it shows up in a lot of different in interesting ways.
Could I also just throw in something really quickly? Because from this conversation, it's really making me think about, even though we're not talking about Las Americas, we are, right? So like, I just feel like there's something about the hemisphere that we can totally carve out in the South, right? There's something about, so when I think about Jim Crow and I think about this kind of persistent racial discourse of mestizaje, I don't really see a massive difference, right? I don't see this kind of like polar difference. And I wonder if the conversation about Afro-Latinx folks in the South and the continued experiences of Afro-Latinx folks with white supremacy and anti-Blackness I feel like that's a hemispheric conversation, right? And it's not to just be like, I'm all about specificity and like the nuances and all of the complexities, but I'm also kind of like, because I would love to even dig in more into this notion of whiteness, right? Because for a really long time, especially in Central America, mestizo doesn't mean to be brown, right? Like to be mestizo literally means to be as criollo, as Eurocentric standards of beauty and phenotype. You know, I mean, for a long time, I thought mestizo was white until I went to college and I'm reading Gloria Anzaldúa and I was like, oh, she thinks she's brown. So there was this moment, oh, brownness is a thing, right? So like even Jennifer Jones's work, which, you know, she's wonderful, lovely sociologist, they may not great, but there's this allure of brownness, right? What is this like intrigue of browning, you know, America, right? What's this allure? I mean, even think about Claudia Milian, right? Like she does this beautiful book where she clearly gives us examples of African Americans in, but I was like, they're Black people in America, right? So like there are actual Black folks there that do diasporic work too, right? So it's just, there's something about brownness and that's really complicated. And like, I'm interested in like, yeah, maybe unpacking that or just figuring it out because it's also so to come up for me. All of my ethnic work, it's something that's always in my brain.
Mm-hmm. 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 I can't see your image, Pablo. I don't know if that's for everyone. Okay. I was like, it's just your image kind of went
It's a
out.
great
Yeah,
box.
I mean,
but I hear you.
Yeah.
Oh no. Okay.
So, you know. And I think that brownness too, that conversation about brownness is super important, just given demographics in the US, right? So definitely becomes kind of there's like a brown hegemony when you think about Latinidad in the US. And I think particularly coming from Caribbean spaces, that is very alienating to me because that's not really how people talk about race at all in the Caribbean. So I'm just like, what is this brownness? What are we talking about here? But I think that's also why it's really important to think about the role of indigeneity when we talk about Latinidad, because that has kind of been used as like especially in like South America, certain parts of Central America, and in Mexico, has been used as the crutch for kind of understanding Latinidad and obscuring its preference for whiteness and its attempts to achieve whiteness, right? So I think that we do have to talk about brownness, but I also feel like coming from a Caribbean space and studying Caribbean people is very like, it's very weird because the extent of what I see in terms of brownness is occasionally Puerto Ricans and Dominicans saying that they are read as Mexican, saying that they are read as Latino, but they don't have any other framework for that aside from like, they see that I'm sort of brown and that's why they say that. But brownness doesn't hold that same like political significance or political usage for the people that I study and where I come from. So it is kind of, it's very interesting.
Absolutely. And I've always understood this brownness to be this like very Latinx studies narrative, right? Like, so when Latinos
does anyone else
in the
wanna,
20s.
Oh, sorry. Pablo, are you talking? You're muted. I'm sorry.
Oh, I can hear him.
Yeah, I can hear him too.
Yeah, I can hear him. It's just the gray box.
Go ahead.
I'm so sorry. I apologize on behalf of Hartford, Connecticut. No, Hartford, my internet, Hartford, Connecticut be so spotty. I don't understand it. No, I just wanted to say really quickly, I think this brownness, which is, by the way, you know, Jim Hooker writes this amazing book on like theorizing race in the Americas, and like brownness is clearly something that Vasconcelos is talking about, is really interested in. Anzaldúa sees it as a really important nexus of empowerment for Latinx folks in the Southwest. So there's something alluring about this that becomes very kind of, it becomes a trope, right? Because like reading the work of like Nancy López or Clara Rodriguez, right? These moments of like the census, right? And how Latinos do not fit the census. And like even the work of like the Afro-Latino Forum in 2010, was it 2010? It was 2010. Where folks were like, check both, right? Check Black and Hispanic, right? There's something about brownness that allows Hispanidad become palpable or understand something. It's a weird, exceptional narrative that I'm just like, yeah. The fact that Latino folks think they don't fit into the census categories has all and everything to do with mestizaje and its relationship to U.S. imperialism notions of Black and white binary. But there's something about brownness that's always just like Afro-Men browning the U.S. South. Please, someone explain that to me. And I think there's something about the fact that maybe folks also just don't see the Blackness of Afro-Mexican. Blackness becomes something here that's not legible within a U.S. worldview.
Or perhaps it allows that distinction between Latin America and the U.S. world, right? That desire to not kind of fit the binary or reject the binary classifications of race and kind of exist in this supposedly neutral middle ground. But of course, obviously, we know how that actually operates.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's meant to be a space of empowerment, but a space that is also not Black and not white. And so, you know, it's a space that, you know, when we say Black and brown folks, what are we actually saying? And am I in the brown or the Black? You know, it's you know, it's meant to be a, you know, something of empowerment, but it's also, you know, distinguishing itself from Blackness, and it's regional too. So I mean, in New York, I can be Black or brown, but in the South, I was definitively Black. And so, you know, where we are, and in Miami, certainly, right, I was Black, but also in North Carolina. In New York, I'm Puerto Rican or Dominican, and so maybe that's, you know, that's sort of brown, but I'm also Black. You know, so I think regionally also, you know, this how we're racialized, you know, can change a lot.
But I think what's fascinating about this conversation goes back to what Dr. Oro was saying before, which is that if we think about it in Las Americas, like we're talking about people who are thinking of themselves brown in the United States, but certainly check the box white in their home countries, right? Like if we look at like census documentation in Latin America, like so like this is like, we got to think about that contradiction too.
Absolutely. Well, there's a way that exclusion can lead people to see themselves as more racialized and more brown, right? And that kind of as a framework for understanding their own oppression. And it is complicated, right? Like I saw a panel at a sociology conference last year that was titled "Being Oppressed but Also the Oppressor," and it was about white Latinos. And I was like, that's interesting, like because there's a way that even in discussing whiteness in Latinidad, there's still a centering of white Latinos as oppressed. And I think that we need to question that. Like, why is that the automatic kind of, I don't know. It's just, I think it's a little problematic.
Well, Danielle can say more to this, but we were recently working on an article where we were talking about like Black Marielitos who came over in the 1980s and talking about like what was going on with that. And one of the reviewers was like, well, you know, you've got to recognize that there's racism that white Cubans were experiencing as well. Like you got to think about whiteness and all this. And Danielle writes back to me, no, the power structure in Miami at that time is white Cubans. They were the mayor, they were the city council, they were the, so don't sit here and talk to us about how white Cubans are oppressed in the 1980 when they had all the power. And I was like, oh, that's a good point. That's what we put in our response.
Yeah, I mean, as long as they're going to you know, white segregated schools and living in Coral Gables, you know, there's no way you're going to tell me, right, that, you know, there's some kind of structural oppression going on. Maybe you have a bad experience when you walk into a store and you're speaking Spanish, right? And that's real, right? That's a real experience. But it's not, you know, what we're talking about when we're talking about anti-Black racism. And
it's not oppression. You wouldn't call that oppression.
We need like 20 moments on Miami because it's so fascinating. Because it's in Miami, the folks that will identify as white in Latin America will then come to Miami and still identify as white. It's a different process, right? There's no browning that's really happening in Miami.
Mm.
Are, you know, darker skinned, you know, and you are not able to
Talk about
get access to whiteness. And so it's this place where, because Latinos have achieved this dominant, right, not only in numbers, this dominant position not only in numbers but also, you know, economically and politically, that they're comfortable saying that they're white. And so it's this kind of like case study of what happens when you tell white Latinos that they're white and you treat them as such, right? What then happens to this browning? It disappears. It disappears because it's not needed anymore.
That's fascinating. Very fascinating.
I can ask another question, but I also want to leave space if anyone else wants to continue to respond to this conversation that I think is really rich. Okay. I think Professor Benson, you started talking about this when you were talking about policing and community building, but I'm curious from other folks too, sort of what are the forms of activism, ways of circumventing white supremacy, but also I think more importantly, building community and building sort of activist spaces and community spaces that you're seeing in your work. Yeah.
I'll answer while Dr. Benson does her stuff.
I just didn't answer because I thought she said I'd answered already.
No, she said,
I was like, she must want someone else to say it.
I wanted to just, I mean, so we found like a lot of activist circles that were specifically for Afro-Cubans. And so what's interesting is, so, you know, I'm getting involved now in this project with the History of Miami Museum, where they're highlighting Black stories and the Black history of Miami through the civil rights movement and to the present. And there wasn't a lot of involvement among Black Cubans in the civil rights struggles. But you do see now second generation, third generation folks involved with Black Lives Matter. And so there's definitely a kind of a generational change where, you know, as folks are now growing up in the US, as, you know, Black people, that they're now involved in, you know, these activist circles. And so, and likewise, you know, when you had the protests on July 11th in Cuba, and then you had these massive protests in Miami, right, because they thought finally the revolution is going to fall, as they always do. The space was very white, right? You didn't see Black Cubans protesting in a lot of these spaces, and a lot of those white Cubans had Trump flags, right, and all of this. But you know, I happened to be in Miami at the time, and so I'm talking, you know, to all of the folks, you know, that I kind of shared these activist circles with, and they said, no, that's not our space, right? That's not our space. You know, we might agree with, you know, the protests that are happening in Cuba, but it's not our space in Miami. I'm not going to be in there with those folks with the Trump flags and all of that. And so, you know, there's a much higher comfortability, you know, among Black Cubans, particularly in Miami, to be part of Black Lives Matter, right? You know, and rather than, right, being part of this kind of larger Cuban, I don't know, protest culture.
And it's like the Cuban Miami, right? Like right? And there's I noticed that there was kind of an instrumental use of those protests in Cuba by white Cubans in Miami trying to push for their causes. It was so like, it was just so obvious. But it's a way in which that gets oftentimes like, it gets distorted, right? Because people don't know the history and because people don't understand what's happening in Cuba, they kind of just rest on what they can see, which is the, you know, people, white Cubans in Miami saying communism needs to fall. And it's really, really interesting.
I'm curious because, I'm so sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, because you've done these oral histories and you've been able to see some of these generational changes, I'm curious to hear about sort of the change over time story with Afro-Cubans, right? Like, what, you started to talk about generational shifts, but how does it look different for those who were sort of shaped by Jim Crow segregation and more recent immigrants, or I'm just curious about that change over time story.
I think this is a really interesting another both and. Like, on one hand, sort of like how we started out at the very beginning, there's not a lot of change over time. There's still very much strong anti-Blackness and white supremacy that even second generation Cubans, Black Cubans, talk to us about, that they still see. They talk to us about it a lot in their relationships and like who they're dating and their social circles. So we hear a lot about that. So we definitely, I think it's really important not to say that the change over time is one of progress of like racism getting less. That's not what we hear about at all. Maybe what we do hear really strongly about with change over time is also about like community building. In the 1960s, we heard a lot initially about Black Cubans building community as Black Cubans, where they had a neighborhood called Alapata, like it was in between Little Havana and an African American neighborhood, where they were building their own communities. And a lot of the second generation folks we talked to also talked more about their relationships with African Americans. They talked about like those relationships in school. They talked about the relationship with African Americans, but also Puerto Ricans, but relationships in school, relationships in other places. And those were really important relationships for them in a way that it seemed almost stronger than it was for their parents. And which, like I think Dr. Clealand said, leads to a different type of activism, right? So that's a type of activism that isn't just an Afro-Cuban activism. It's an activism that allows them to participate strongly and as Black folks in Black Lives Matter.
And they're more likely to be Democrats. I mean, a lot of Black Cubans
really quickly. The La Vidas Negras Importan movement, which certainly borrows from Black Lives Matter, is something that I've been recently interested in writing about, because about 2 summers ago, there was kidnapping in El Trum de la Cruz around 5 Garifuna activists, land activists, and everyone in New York City organized in the South Bronx to bring it to the attention of the city, right? Just to bring it to the attention. So they protested and mobilized, with signs of La Vidas Negras Importan, Vidas Importan, right? So Garifuna Lives Matter. And I think there's something that is really telling about the transgenerational activism that happens when La Vidas Negras Importan is activated in a space like New York. It really demonstrates how Garifuna folks have also been very present in these movements, but it also really, for me, right, having to like uncover these like embodied archives of like even Garifuna folk movement, right, like participation of Black Latinx folks in these movements that are very much about a certain political conflict in America, but also knowing that there's always been this diasporic presence in those movements is something that has been really interesting to see develop and see how sometimes, I go back and forth if it's like borrowing, right? Or is it tells a complicated relationship, right? Because I think there's a lot of generational differences when it comes to that. And it's also the younger generation, right? Like US born Garinagu folks here who are very much adapting Black Lives Matter mantra, adapting La Vidas Negras Importan analysis on the stuff that's happening in Honduras and the stuff that's happening in
just I wanted to I guess touch on BLM, and I think that I also see what Dr. Oro is talking about in terms of the adoption of La Vida Negra Importan in Puerto Rico, particularly last year after George Floyd was murdered. There was a vigil in Loíza for him, and it was mostly Afro-Puerto Ricans who attended. In a U.S. space, though, I see a lot of that happening, not as much in Central Florida. I see it more in the Northeast, with, Puerto Ricans and Dominicans getting involved with BLM. When I did my interviews in Central Florida, it was 2016. So it was a very different space than we're in right now, which is why I'm going back next summer to do more interviews. A lot has changed, right? In these past 5 years. And in 2016, that was the year that Philando Castile was murdered in Minneapolis, and a few years before, in 2012, Trayvon Martin was murdered, like in Central Florida, right, in Sanford. And so one of the things that I did was I asked my respondents if they remembered that case in particular. A lot of folks talked about how they live very close to Sanford. They remember, they remember the protests, they remember the police, they remember all the, tension in that area. But then in terms of how people were responding to BLM, I think there was definitely, that's where I saw actually the most differences based on people's race. Like that is precisely where I saw the biggest cleavages among folks that I spoke to. Folks who were, lighter skinned, regardless of how they identified racially, were more likely to say, like, this is because people aren't respecting the cops. People need to respect authority. Kind of these negative narratives that we hear mostly from right-wing media sources and online. And then, dark-skinned Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, regardless of how they identify racially, were definitely of the mindset of like, this worries me, this is extreme, this is not okay, like we have to like do something about this. And there was a little bit of the respectability in there where it was like, maybe some people need to be more respectful of police officers, but it was nowhere near where it was for lighter skinned folks. So I think that was definitely a point where I was like, okay, this is where I'm seeing the biggest differences, that regardless of how committed people are to the nationalist projects, that when it comes to this particular issue, folks are realizing like, no, I am also in danger. I am also not safe due to what's happening here. And I think it's really important also to think of how Latinidad is embroiled in all of this, right? So George Zimmerman being half Peruvian, or the man who filmed Walter Scott being murdered being a Dominican barber, a Black Dominican barber, or the man who filmed Eric Garner being murdered as well was a Puerto Rican, and who was then later kind of targeted by NYPD because of his involvement in that. So we're here, we're involved, we're part of it. Even if it's not like centered, we're definitely embroiled in all these things. And I think it's really important to consider that. And the case of Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman is particularly important for understanding just why our work matters, right? Like why our work matters, because that is a prime example of anti-Blackness among Latinos, and a very, a murderous example of how it can play out. So we do have to care about how whiteness and Blackness plays out in Latino spaces, in the South and elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'm shirking my moderator duties because I'm like writing down all of this wisdom. I mean, I just think that's the discussion of the Trayvon Martin case and the sort of like particular life and death consequences of the anti-Blackness within Latino communities, I think is a really striking way to summarize some of what we've been talking about here. So Professor Oro got us started early on thinking about Latinidad as a failed project for Black Latinos. And I guess as we're coming towards the end of our time together, I'm curious to hear you all respond to that. I mean, Professor Oro expanding on that, and other co-panelists maybe responding to that about sort of like what is the project of Latinidad given the the insights that you all have sort of brought from this panel. What is the utility of it? Is there a utility of it? And sort of how do you make sense of that as a category, given the work that you all do? And maybe the answer is that it is a failed project, and that that's great. Like let's have that conversation. I'm just sort of curious to hear about that.
Yeah. So I'll let more people say about Latinidad as a failed project or not. I think I'm going to say I'm in agreement with Dr. Oro, but I'm going to talk about it from a different angle, which is that when I think, like what I wrote about in my first book, when I think about racelessness or, racial democracy or mestizaje, we use a lot of different terms to talk about this idea of, like, in Cubans, we're all Cubans, right? We're not white, we're not black, we're all Cubans. The nationalist project of we are all Cubans is a failed project in Cuba. And it looks differently at different times, but I think of it as something where we could call it a goal, like it's a goal to get to be all Cubans. But we have to recognize that idea came out of a strategic moment, which was the Wars for Independence, to try and fight off Spain, and they needed to come up with an army. And then every time that it's been mobilized, whether that's mobilizing it again in 1912 to silence Black activists and murder Black activists, or whether that's with the revolutionary government in 1959, it's been mobilized as a way of overlaying or disappearing differences in order to say that we're all one nation, but that nation has always been imagined as being a whiter or a white nation. So if we can say that project of we are all Cubans, again, whatever you want to call it, racelessness, racial democracy, is a failed project in Cuba, you can imagine that what then people bring with them to the United States and what is still created, it's created in a particular historical moment, in a particular situation where Latinos are trying to interface with racism and imperialism in the United States, but the response of Latinidad is still strategic, and it's still leaning towards whiteness, and it still disappears Blackness and doesn't want to talk about it. So that's why I have to agree. I agree based more on where it comes from, starting in Latin America, and then other people can say more about what it looks like here.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm on the fence.
Yeah.
I think this is. I love that.
Do your thing. Sorry, I can only see myself now. Everything else is gray. So I'm like,
no. Sorry. Hartford, Connecticut. I'm on the fence about this, and I really love that you said it, because it's really making me think about, are we challenging Latinidad, or do we just need to leave it all together? I think in Miami, it's definitely a failed project. And I see that because most of the relationships that Black Cubans have are with Afro-Puerto Ricans, Afro-Dominicans, Haitians, Afro-Haitians, other Black immigrant groups. It's not with, their white co-ethnics. And so, but then as a lighter skinned Black person growing up, in the Bronx and in Mount Vernon, it wasn't necessarily always a failed project for me. So, and I know that I'm lighter skinned, right? And I have this certain privilege, but, yeah, I don't know. I'm on the fence about this, but we have to keep exploring this.
Yeah, I think it really, and I'm sad that Dr. Odo had to refresh his browser, because I'm gonna directly respond to his framing, which is that I think that whether Latinidad is a failed project or not really depends on what you see as the end goals of that project.
Yeah.
Right? So if the end goal of Latinidad is unity and equality, it's a failed project. But taking my highly cynical approach, so I'll frame it that way, it's very cynical. If the project of Latinidad is to perpetuate mestizaje in a US space, then it is a successful project. So that's kind of where I land on it. It depends on what you see as the goals of that project. And I don't think that the goals of that project were ever actually unity. I think that it was really just the perpetuation of mestizaje in this space.
So wait, then Dr. Rosado, does that mean the perpetuation of mestizaje is a white project?
Yes, okay, as a white supremacist project, 100%. Yes, absolutely. Yes. And in that sense, it has been very successful. It has been very successful, and we are part of a group of people that are leveraging challenges against that. And we're leveraging challenges against that project, that white supremacist project of perpetuating mestizaje, not the project of unity, because we've always been down for unity. Give me unity and equality any day. I love that. But where has that been? I don't think we've ever experienced it. Personally, I haven't experienced that sense of unity or wanting to really like bridge differences. So like, what are we challenging too, right? Like, I see myself as challenging that, like that perpetuation of mestizaje. So when someone comes out right now, the census data came out and it was like, Latinos are way more likely now to say that there's some other race than to say that they're white or that they're black. And I'm like, that's just mestizaje. Like, it's further entrenching itself. I'm like, I'm not surprised, nor do I think it's a positive thing either. Like, I don't think that you could just look at those things and say it's a positive or negative, because it depends on how it's being mobilized, right? And in this case, I feel like more people saying that there's some other race is just further perpetuating that project of Latinidad, of that mestizaje project.
I mean, just to add on, and I'm sorry for having to like refresh the browser. Now I get to see all of your beautiful faces, and so I'm excited. One of the things that, inherently, Latinidad as a failed project, I think about Latinidad within the scope of the Latinx studies as well. So when I'm talking about the failures of Latinidad, I'm talking also about the intellectual impulse within Latinx studies to talk about this pan-ethnic unity, right? So I think a lot of the work of like Torres Salian, right, in the inaugural, right, Journal of Latino Studies, right, where he's like talking about the Pentagon and making, right, the very idea of inventing Latinos, right? Yeah, so, for me, Latinidad is a hemispheric travel of mestizaje, right? And mestizaje in all of its afterlives, right? Whether it's neoliberal multiculturalism or whether it's Afro-nation state, right? There's something about Latinidad that continues to fail Black people, right? There's something about Latinidad that continues to fail indigenous people, right? So even the debates about like, well, Latinx, right? Like, it doesn't feel right. Well, it shouldn't feel right because it's a queering of Latinidad, right? So if you're not down to queer shit, yeah, Latinx is gonna feel really uncomfortable, right? So like even thinking about shit, even Latinidad fails queer people, right? That context. So I think there's something about, I'm very like, also we need to trouble Afro-Latinidad too, because I think there's also this very much kind of, now we have an imagined subject, right? And then in the imagined Afro-Latinx subject has to be Dominican, has to be Puerto Rican, right? Schomburg has been resurrected. Well, what do we do with the fact that Schomburg has been resurrected, right? And I'm all down, listen, bring Tío Abuelo Schomburg back to life. I'm down. I think he doesn't get all the credit where the credit is due. But what is the political project behind resurrecting? Are we going to really understand other Black Latinx folks who did similar work but don't get the institutional pedigree or the institutional recognition? Because Afro-Latinidad become, even if once we turning to social media, right? There's an archetype, right? And that archetype doesn't include folks, right? It doesn't include Afro-Mexicans, right? It doesn't include Afro-Bolivians, right? And there's something about nationalism, and nationalism is a Kool-Aid we all drink, right? But it's a Kool-Aid that has a lot of toxicity, right? It's a Kool-Aid that has a lot of racialization. So when we think about even, like I read Silvio's piece and I'm just like, Silvio, pero there's a racialization when it comes to cultural nationalism, right? Like the fact that Central Americans in particular, right, are always ascribed to be mestizo, brown, and assimilated to Mexicanness, right? There's something about the continued invisibility. There's also the continued racialization of Central Americans within a hierarchy, right? Like I remember reading this line from Marlene Davila's book. Lord, I can't remember which of them, right? Because it's like a ton of them. But there's this book where she's like really talking about Latinos Inc., and like the making of a people. And if we were to literally flip the map of the hemisphere, we could literally see the racialized hierarchies of the nation states, right? And there's something in Latinidad that continues to be the goal, right? That there continues to be the goal. And that whiteness can mean American dream. The whiteness can mean multiple things about social mobility, right? Or whiteness can also mean anything but Black, anything but Indigenous, right? Because this is also where I'm like, y'all know mestizaje was as racially violent as Jim Crow. Like mestizaje requires people to literally let go of all of their indigeneity, of their Blackness, and become a national subject. Like that's incredibly violent, especially in the context of Central America. Like there was literally state-sanctioned genocide in this community, so the project of mestizaje could literally work, right? In Honduras, to be Black means sos caribeño, sos antillano, right? Black comes from elsewhere. It doesn't come from the nation state. You're alien to this space, right? So mestizaje is a very, very violent project that doesn't get enough it doesn't get enough attention on the violence that it creates and the generational violence that it creates.
Yep. That's an excellent point.
I mean, this has been so rich. We have, a little bit of time left. Does Professor Clealand, do you want to pose what you've put into the chat to the rest of the group?
Sure. I mean, I was just kind of thinking about, where Black folks fit in their own kind of national images and thinking about, Latinidad doesn't work for Black folks, but Americanness, right, and notions of U.S. nationalism don't work for Black folks in the U.S. either. But what I was writing in there is that the irony is that Black Latinidad is read as Black Americanness because Blackness supposedly lives in the U.S., even though Black folks are just as marginalized as they are hemispherically. And so yeah, it's just very interesting. I mean, nationalism, it's not something that U.S. Black folks engage in, right? I've never had an American flag in my house in my entire life. I have had Puerto Rican flags in my house, and so I think we don't have time for this, but I think what's really interesting is that there's high levels of nationalism among Black, Latin American and Caribbeans for their home countries, even when those countries don't accept them as part of their country. And
Absolutely.
So it's a lot of complexities that I'm thinking about. Yeah.
And how much of that is like nostalgia for the home country versus like a distancing from what's happening here, from Blackness here? Like how it's complicated.
And how much of that is potentially because those nationalistic projects of mestizaje or racelessness or racial democracy in some ways they were attractive in some ways to Black folks, but they meant something different than they did to white folks in Latin America, right? Like this idea of we're all Cubans, I think is something that Black Cubans buy into and believe. And so of course they're going to have the Cuban flag up. It just means something different to them than it's we are all Cubans to white Cubans who see it as a white thing.
Very interesting.
And there's something about nationalism that also. No.
Sorry, I didn't mean to. I was just thinking. I was like, I think that was what I was trying to get at that piece that I just put in Small Axe, Paul, that you had referenced, because I was trying to say that for Nancy Morejon, mestizaje meant something different than it meant to white Cubans, because you have to go through Black consciousness, you have to recognize Blackness, you have to deal and grapple and value Blackness in order to get to mestizaje for Black people. And you don't have to do that for white Latin Americans.
That is fascinating. I'm sorry. I'm just like, you just blew my mind. So good.
Does anyone want to sort of offer any closing thoughts or reflections from this conversation that we had? Okay, well, I feel like this is like a moment to end, even if it's 5 minutes early. I'm feeling like, I don't know, the energy feels like it's closing, and I hope I'm reading that correctly. But I just want to thank you all so much. I mean, this has been, to me, the best of all conference worlds, which is like, you get all of the energy and curiosity and excitement, and you get to wear sweatpants, and it's like, and we get to have like sunlight and get, you know what I mean, and not be in a tiny little conference room somewhere underneath New Orleans. So I'm just so appreciative of you all coming to the Southern Historical Association, you know, being here. You know, not all of you are historians, and it's been really amazing to get to be a part of this and facilitate this conversation. So I know everyone at home is clapping with me, but thank you all. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their conference and a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
This is great. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.